Thank you so much, Nancy, for the introduction. Thank you, Portland Community College, for this opportunity to come and visit and to share some of my experiences with you. And I especially want to thank my dear friend, Professor Brian Hall, for inviting me here and for the International Initiatives program that he runs, which I think is quite relevant to students of Portland Community College and to any campus here. And it's really my passion, and what I focus on is trying to internationalize campuses and expose or talk about global issues with students and colleagues alike. So what I'm trying to do today is give you a little bit of overview of the migration patterns with a focus on sub-Saharan Africa. Now, Professor Hall told me to expand a little bit to make it more general and broad, but of course I can't cover everything. I can't cover all migration patterns and mobility of people in the sub-Saharan region, but I will try as much as possible to touch on specific or highlight specific migrations that I think have been going on for quite some time, some over a historical period and some more recent ones. So I will touch on a few case studies. And I will start by talking to you about migration into sub-Saharan Africa, which many of you probably don't hear about a lot. You hear more about the African slave trade as one of the most important flow of migrants, forced migration outside of the continent, but you probably don't tend to hear about migration into sub-Saharan Africa and why this started to happen and why this experience. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that and also situate myself in this migration because I'm of Lebanese origin, and how on earth did I end up in Sierra Leone in West Africa is part of why I was interested in doing this research in the first place. The second half of my talk will focus more on contemporary migration flows from sub-Saharan Africa into other parts of the world, especially Europe. Now, when we talk about sub-Saharan Africa, what do we mean? What is sub-Saharan Africa? The terminology sub-Saharan Africa really refers to Africa minus North Africa. Minus North Africa means minus the countries that are more sort of lumped into what is known as the Middle East or the Arab region, and these countries include Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, Libya, and Egypt. And the rest sometimes is referred to as so-called Black Africa, and this is the Africa that we're going to talk about today. And I'm going to start by sharing my own personal experience. I wanted to say that I myself, and I'm an immigrant of Lebanese descent, born and raised in Sierra Leone. My parents immigrated there. As a child, though, I never felt this sense of belonging to this space, to my block, to my neighborhood, to my little town, Freetown, the capital. And I wondered why. You know, I was there for 17 years, but never really got the sense of the place, never interacted with so-called Black kids around in my neighborhood. And I always wondered why this segregation. So from my huge balcony perched on the 3rd floor overlooking this most enchanting peninsula carved out of the Atlantic Ocean with picturesque sunsets, I gazed passively for hours at the kids playing happily in the streets. I felt an invisible barrier to my immediate surroundings. I could not understand the roots of this barrier until, of course, later on when I became an adult. And the school that I went to, I'll show you a picture of that school, the Lebanese school, also had a predominantly Lebanese community that attended it, which further separated me from the majority Black population. And I burned to play in the streets under the African sun with African kids, but unfortunately that never happened. I did not will this position I found myself in, and knew that the world of restrictive interactions among Lebanese kin, neighbors, and business partners never ever defined who I am. As I grew up, I realized that my social position was defined by my birth. I was so-called native born in Sierra Leone, yet I was considered non-native. I was actually part of these tensions and dualities that were associated with being a so-called white immigrant in sub-Saharan Africa. This is what I came to be defined as. Now, you may not think of me as a white person necessarily, but that was how I was defined as in that situation in sub-Saharan Africa. And I learned that the story of these divisions and racism began with British colonialism in the whole entire sub-Saharan region. So what I wanted to do today is give you a glimpse of British colonialism since the 1800s, and Sierra Leone was actually one of the first colonies. So I'm going to give you a glimpse of those times and how they affected essentially interactions and tensions that were going on between immigrants, entrepreneurs, and the rest of the population. So this is where I grew up. And that's the Lebanese school that I attended. And as you can see, Freetown, the capital of Sierra Leone, is situated on the harbor. This is very important because the British exploited this harbor, this port, and started to export a lot of raw materials from the interior of Sierra Leone and other parts of West Africa so that they could fuel the industries, because in the 1800s, industrialization was growing in Europe, and that was the reason for the British expansion into parts of Africa. And so essentially, they were interested in these port cities from which they could transport raw materials to Europe and other parts of the world. And at one time, as you can see here on the map on the left-hand side, Africa was entirely colonized by different colonial powers, predominantly British, but of course there were French and there were Portuguese and Dutch colonization and so forth, with the exception, of course, of what was called Abyssinia, which is present-day Ethiopia. As you can see, the whole entire continent was exploited during the rise of industrialization and the need for raw materials for the high demand and high populations and rising populations in Europe. Now, the right-hand side is more of a modern map of Africa, and all these modern borders that you see were artificial borders that were created by the British colonials and other colonials. They did not really represent the people. They did not respect, for instance, the ethnic solidarity that existed there. They did not respect the trade routes that were already established in those areas, whether in West Africa and other areas. And this is unfortunate because this is what led to a lot of migrations within the continent of Africa and out of Africa, because this disturbed the trade routes. So the trade routes were moved from the interior of many of these countries that you see toward the coast so that they could fuel this export industry, one, and also there were political tensions because the borders were so artificial that what happened is it brought together groups, ethnic groups that did not relate to each other. So they were now mostly struggling and competing against each other for valued resources. So it brought together people who didn't really, were not really related to each other, and actually separated others that were part of, one cohesive ethnic group. This is the problem that sub-Saharan Africa still suffers from today. That's why you have a lot of political conflicts, for instance, about Rwanda, for instance, and the genocide between the Hutus and the Tutsis, and I could go on and on in terms of different ethnic conflicts that are going on there that are actually related to all these artificial boundaries that were created by largely British colonialism and other forms of colonialism. But British colonials were the masters of this idea of divide and conquer. Divide and conquer. And they took advantage of it and actually gave preferential treatment for these immigrant entrepreneurs, such as the Lebanese and the Indians who came from India, from Punjab and from Gujarat. They gave them preferential treatment and actually used them to help them with translation and with connections with the local groups, ethnic groups and so forth, to help them with the trade. So they were what was considered the middleman, these communities. Of course, what that led to is a lot of tensions and resentments from the majority population toward these immigrant groups that actually started to monopolize a lot in the area of trade and export, and the population at large suffered a lot because of this privileged class. Now, this is the railway that the British colonials constructed in Sierra Leone and of course in many other parts of East Africa, which helped them transport the raw materials from the inland areas to the coastal areas. And Lebanese Indians and other immigrant entrepreneurs were actually very resourceful in terms of transporting these materials, in terms of connecting with local chiefs, chieftains and so forth, to help these transportations and to help the British colonials essentially by selling these products and crops wholesale to them, and catering more to the British colonials rather than the needs of the population. So for instance, the price of rice became so high and costly for the population. As early as World War I, the population rebelled in a sense with a riot against the Lebanese traders who charged 400% for the price of rice, which was something that the population depended on. All this caused a lot of tensions. This goes back to European colonization, the slave trade, and this is what I was suggesting you probably know more about, the African slave trade and out-migration from Africa. But what I was talking about is migration into sub-Saharan Africa because of the British colonialization and the use of immigrant entrepreneurs as middlemen. Now, the rise of in status of these immigrant minorities caused a lot of problems, it made them vulnerable minorities. It made them marginalized and discriminated by the population, especially in times of decolonization. During the riots in World War I, you could see the sentiments expressed in some of the local newspapers, for instance in Sierra Leone, about the Lebanese unfeeling brutes, after making money in our country, have planned to destroy us by creating unbearable conditions. There are heartless traders who are aliens. The Lebanese have come here to exploit us. The sentiments continue to be expressed in newspapers as recent as today. You could see here the Lebanese problem in Sierra Leone. This continued to be the sentiment expressed from the population. Now, all this led to something during the decolonization period. For instance, Sierra Leone was, gained independence in 1961, and the population had fears, especially in terms of political participation of the Lebanese minority. They had fears, a lot of fears, that since they had economic success, they may now, usurp power, political power. So they amended the constitution and added that clause to essentially exclude those that were not of Negro-African descent. That is the language that was used back then, to exclude the Lebanese minority because they feared that they may also usurp political power in addition to the economic successes that they had already enjoyed in the country during British colonialism. So what happened in this case, by essentially adding that kind of clause, it basically forced the Lebanese who wanted to continue to stay in Sierra Leone, which was by that time, of course, considered their homeland, to essentially naturalize, just like we have naturalization process in the United States for immigrants coming in who were not born here. What happened at that time is people who were born there who were not of Negro African descent, including the Lebanese and other minorities like Indians and so forth, were essentially forced to naturalize even when they were born there, even though they were born there. And they had ancestry, sometimes for generations. They were still essentially pushed into that. And this is common in many countries where naturalization or citizenship is granted not necessarily by birth, but by ancestry and blood. Even Germany does this. So this is not just common in parts of Africa. Even Germany and other countries, in the Middle East also, it's by ancestry and blood rather than by place of birth. But this is more connected to British colonialism and its effect on the continent of dividing these communities. Now, John Nakar is very, very famous. He's an Afro-Lebanese. There were many of them, mostly with Lebanese fathers and black mothers. And so he was one of those who were mixed. And he was the one who was planning to run for a political position back then during independence in the 1960s. And because of that fear by a political party in Sierra Leone that he may gain power, political power, which they didn't want to happen because of the economic successes of the Lebanese minority, they they amended the constitution and he contested it. I mean, he felt, of course, a patriot in Sierra Leone, but when it came to political power, he was excluded. And he contested this exclusion and marginalization, and essentially won that, by having the court in England say that this amendment was unconstitutional. But this does not really affect, political participation on the ground. It was just on paper. And the exclusion continued in citizenship acts that came later on. For instance, in 1973, which said that a Sierra Leonean could be by birth only if the father and the grandfather were born there and they were of Negro African descent. And by the way, all this language was basically came from British kinds of racism. You see that language also in the British laws concerning citizenship, which I don't have time to go into, but really this was all inherited from the British. So what kind of positions do the Lebanese and other non-black minorities, what are the positions that they can be excluded from? Being president of the country, member of any commission, ambassador, member of the army, permanent secretary, and so on, and so forth, member of parliament. Up to the present, they are still excluded from all of these positions. The Constitution of Sierra Leone also has a clause that discriminates against non-blacks in the country. So if somebody is naturalized, which is what the Lebanese community were forced into, then they cannot run for parliament or any other political position. Even the more recent 2006 amended Citizenship Act did mention all these clauses regarding descent, Negro African descent. So that is exclusion from citizenship and political positions that essentially emerged because of British colonialism in the area, and this is what immigrants of non-African descent or non-black descent experience up to this day. Another example, which I'm going to go through really quickly, is the expulsion of Ugandan Asians from East Africa, also related to essentially privileging the Indian traders in Uganda specifically by the British colonials, which led to resentment by the majority Ugandans. And when Idi Amin took power in 1972 through a military coup, he decided that all people of Asian descent should be, expelled from the country. And those who had chosen to gain Ugandan citizenship actually were stripped of that citizenship and for a while became stateless persons, which is a situation that is so much a violation of human rights because it excludes you from just so many different opportunities. 70,000 of them, which is almost all of them, were forced out of the continent and the country. And there are movies that talk about this, like Mississippi Masala, if you haven't seen. I would strongly recommend it, where there was a conversation between a black Ugandan and his Asian friend, where he said Africa is for Africans, black Africans. And John Cazell, who was one of the founders of Liberia, next to Sierra Leone, also talked about this. Blacks belonged to Africa, and Africa belonged to black people. And yeah, I mean, these sentiments really were related, I argue, to this divide and conquer strategy that was brought about by British colonial power in sub-Saharan Africa. So it's important to know that when we consider migration into sub-Saharan Africa. Now, that is the first part. The second part that I want to talk about in my presentation is migration during post-colonial times, after World War II, where Africans started to migrate, leave the continent and migrate for two main reasons. Labor migration, just like Mexicans and other South Americans come to the United States for economic opportunities and economic betterment, and also because they escape political conflict, genocides, and sometimes droughts, which lead to famine. So they're forced to leave their homes and to leave their countries. So that major second type of migration, out-migration from sub-Saharan Africa, has to do with work and has to do with escaping conditions such as political conflict and war. And what I wanted to say is when they're escaping these conditions, we have international laws that essentially were established by the 1951 Geneva Convention. This was part of the United Nations. The agreement was there's an international obligation to actually protect and assist people fleeing their countries, going to other safer areas, to assist them rather than detain them and deport them or expel them and take them back to their home country. This is an international obligation. And I want to say this to you up front because this is not what's happening. The pictures that I'm going to present tell a different story. They tell a story, you know, where essentially migration policies have focused more on securing the borders and creating frontiers and barriers among countries and people instead of looking and examining the human rights violations that are going on, that are related to these migrations. So very few get that protection that is part of this international obligation that was already established back in 1951, and many of them essentially end up, you know, in very, very bad conditions, or even face the risk of death, as you will see shortly. Not all the migrants leave Africa. Some of them migrate to more developed areas within Africa, such as Ghana, Botswana. I mean, we're not saying that all Africa, you know, is poor. There's no economic development at all. No, that's not true. There are areas that have made significant progress in those particular areas of economic development, and especially South Africa, which has attracted a lot of other African immigrants, especially after the development of the mining industry and the labor system. But even South Africa has started to discriminate against other Africans and started to create all these restrictive laws, immigration policies and laws, and build this electric fence most recently. And many of the immigrants from other African countries are facing what's called xenophobia. I don't know if you've heard of the term xenophobia, which is like this phobia toward immigrants coming in. Now, I'm going to talk finally about the migration, irregular migration that happens from sub-Saharan Africa to Europe mostly. Why Europe? Because as you can see from the map, that is the closest place for them to go to. Instead of them crossing the whole Atlantic to come, say, to the United States, to the Americas, they go essentially to Europe. And I'll show you the map of why Europe. And Europe is more developed economically. Many of them seek better work opportunities, but also because they flee some wars. This is part of North Africa and sub-Saharan Africa. And you can see where Africa meets Europe. Where do you think it meets Europe? where would they go? If they wanted Europe as a destination, where would the immigrants go from Africa? Spain is one, and what is the other country? But Turkey is kind of not Europe. It's not part of the European Union. It wants to be, it really wants to be, but it's not being admitted to the European Union. But look at how far France is. Italy. Well, Morocco is one country that's called the transition country. It's still in Africa, right? And it's not the final destination of the immigrants coming from sub-Saharan Africa, from all these countries, Mauritania, Mali. I'm sorry? Well, it's still far away there. But Italy is very close. What is also close? That is an island there. Sicily is part of Italy. Yeah. And Portugal is actually not that developed, so most of them go to Spain, and from there they continue to France and other parts of the more developed Europe. But another tiny island south of Sicily, Malta. Malta in 2007, just very recently, joined what is called the European Union. And so that is a very good entry point for the immigrants, and it's also very close to get to from North Africa. Do you see why? The strategy is here for them to enter either Spain or Italy or Malta. Now, why does the country have to belong to the European Union? What does belonging to the European Union provide for the immigrants? Yeah, and why? Because of an agreement called what? There's an agreement that was essentially established among all the countries of the European Union that basically has no borders. So once you get to one of these countries, you can go to another one. It's called the Schengen Agreement, the Schengen Agreement. So even if one is applying, say, for a visa to go to Spain, I mean, Americans don't have to apply for a visa to go to any part of Europe, but non-Europeans have to. I have to also when I go there. So if I apply for a visa, for instance, to Spain, I can visit not only Spain, but go to Italy, go to France, go to Germany, Austria, wherever I want, any member of the European Union. So this is a good strategy for them. Let's try to get to Spain, to Italy, to Malta, and from then we are free to go to other parts of Europe and seek a better life. Now, of course, that doesn't always happen, as we know, even in the United States, where they talk about the American dream and all these pathways paved with gold and so forth. You know that doesn't always come true, right? But this is the strategy for most of them. But to do that, how do they journey to get to these places? Clearly there's a barrier, and this barrier is a maritime barrier. So it's not just a land barrier. So they have to take boats, right? They have to take something that floats on the water. And as you know from the stories of Cubans trying to enter Miami, for instance, Florida, or other parts of the United States, it's not an easy journey, right? What could happen? What could possibly go wrong? The boat could sink, because these are usually, frankly, crappy boats. They're not like boats that are solidly constructed. It's probably constructed by the local community. They probably put a lot of people on it too. So, of course, it creates more of a disaster. And this is very unfortunate. And these are the human rights considerations we have to look at when we examine migration policy. So right now, the International Organization of Migration suggests that there's about 3.5 to 4 million Africans in Europe. That's substantial. That's about 0.5% of the total European Union. That's significant. And so it shows that many of them have made that journey from North Africa and reached Europe. And most of them are what's called irregular migrants, which here is also referred to as illegal migration. But mostly in the migration literature, we don't like to use the word illegal. That's a dirty word for us because of all these philosophical and ethical implications. People were mobile for many, many centuries. So why all of a sudden these barriers that are created created, across artificial borders. So if we want to think of it from that perspective, we just look at it as undocumented, migration or irregular migration. Transition countries would be those North African countries, because first the journey starts from the home country, West Africa, East Africa, Central Africa, and then from there you have to go to Morocco, or Algeria, or Libya, and sometimes Egypt, in order to get to those destination points, Spain, Italy, and Malta. We talked about border security versus human rights policy framework. Usually it's the human rights violations that are overlooked, because politicians in Europe, just like politicians in the United States, are more concerned about appeasing populist demands. I don't know what your sentiment personally is about migration, but there is also a substantial anti-immigrant sentiment in this country because of all the myths that circulate about them taking away all the jobs, although most of what they do is really what's called the 3D jobs, the dirty, the difficult, and the dangerous jobs, and they do contribute essentially to economic growth rather than take away jobs. Now, migration policies, because they focus more on securing the borders, have resulted in all these bilateral agreements, for instance, between Italy and these countries in North Africa, especially the Tunisians and the Libyans. They have provided support to them to secure the borders, to have centers of detention, to detain anyone coming from sub-Saharan Africa, and to actually expel them and basically try as much as possible to detain them and send them back as voluntary repatriation. This is just one of many abandoned ships. One of those ships with a whole load of people, more than the ship could handle, that was found in Lampedusa, Italy. You see, again, they look for all these islands that are close to the North African area, because that would make it easier. The journey would be shorter. And as soon as they get there, they can from there go freely to other parts of Europe. So you can see Lampedusa, Italy, is even closer, to the North African coast of Tunisia than, say, Malta. So they try to get there. Many of them actually get detained, sent back, but that doesn't deter them from trying again. Just like many Mexicans are sent back at the US-Mexico border, but that doesn't really deter them from trying. And many of them, make several attempts to come back. Now, in Morocco, interesting situation here, because look at the tip in that city of Tangier. You see that Strait of Gibraltar? You know how long it is? 9 miles. But 9 miles is something I could walk. 9 miles, it would take me, I don't know how long, but I could do it so pretty quickly. But what is it that makes the journey dangerous, even though it's just 9 miles? The wind, the currents, because you have the Mediterranean Sea meeting with the Atlantic Ocean. So it creates strong, strong currents. So even though the journey is very short, they certainly have to wait in Tangier. Some African immigrants wait there in that transition country for days, sometimes weeks, sometimes months, so that they could find the appropriate time, the appropriate weather to cross. And even then, even after the wait, there's a lot of smugglers, by the way, that work on this, just like the coyotes, again here, between US and Mexico. So they wait, take the journey. Some of them, unfortunately, drown also during that journey. But the idea is to reach Spain. Now, interesting enough, in Morocco, northern Morocco was colonized by the Spanish at one time. So what we have is this very interesting situation. Even though the Spanish withdrew from Morocco, they kept 2 particular cities. These are the only 2 European cities that you find in Africa proper. What are those cities? One of them is Ceuta. You see that Ceuta? That's a Spanish city inside Morocco. And the other one is Melilla. You see those cities? They are considered Spanish territory. And so this is Europe in Africa, actually. So what do you think the migrants would do? They try first to enter come from sub-Saharan Africa, go through the Algerian desert, and go all the way there to try to enter Ceuta and Melilla. Now, you may think this is easy, right? But what kind of obstacles may these immigrants face? What do you think the Spanish authorities would do to try to prevent this entry into Ceuta and Melilla? Shoot them. What would they do to deter them? Border control, so what would they do? Would they construct anything there? Fences, exactly. We have a fence also at the US-Mexico border, right? So let me show you the fences that are constructed to deter them from entering. So these are some of the migrants that travel very light, usually just with like, a few personal belongings, and they walk a lot too. And they have all these sort of makeshift arrangements in Morocco and Algeria before they try to enter Ceuta and Melilla to get to Spain. So what happens is there's also discrimination and xenophobia that they face. In the newspapers, they've been called black locals and very horrible racist terms. They say they're invading northern Morocco. So even the Moroccans are racist toward black Africans, and the Spanish are racist toward the Moroccans. This is how it works. It's all this racism. And many of them, basically, the Moroccans work with the Spanish authorities to try also to detain the black immigrants trying to enter Ceuta and Melilla and send them back. So, fences, border fences. Now, which one is in Morocco that divides Ceuta from the rest of Morocco, and which one is in the US? Can you tell? One of them is in the US. The thing is, it's not easy to tell. The most important thing is think of it philosophically. It's all these border fences to try to divide people, to try to limit the possibilities of immigrants coming in from, say, lower developed areas to higher developed areas. This is the whole intention. Whether it's the US-Mexico border, whether it's the border between the Spanish territories of Ceuta and Melilla and Morocco, it does not matter. This is the problem with immigration and restricting immigrants. So the top one is in Morocco that divides Ceuta from Morocco, and the bottom one is the US-Mexico border. You can see the border fence that is being constructed there, all to deter irregular migration. US, of course, shares about 2,000 miles of border with Mexico, and there is a 700-mile border fence that is constructed there. And even with all the technology, by the way, that the US has, even much more sophisticated in technology between, say, Spain and Morocco, it does not deter immigrants from coming in. Many try to cross over illegally, because they can't come in legally. There's a lot of restriction on legal migration. Now, why not construct a fence throughout this area? Because of a natural barrier between the two countries, which is not only mountains, it's easy to construct, this, which is called what? The river. Rio Grande River. Exactly. The Rio Grande River does not allow for a full construction of the border that separates the two countries. Now, you see the similarities also between this situation and the Strait of Gibraltar, that body of water that divides Morocco from Spain again. Same thing. Same fatalities happen. Here, people trying to cross the Rio Grande River also can drown. Over there, they drown also crossing the Strait of Gibraltar, but that doesn't stop the migration flow. Now, here are some African migrants trying to cross over that border fence that I just showed you. You can see, how difficult it is, of course, because of all these wires, barbed wires. Now, he was actually fortunate to be alive. Others are not so fortunate. You can see from the remains of their clothing hanging there, trying to cross over from proper Morocco to these two cities, Spanish territories or enclaves in Morocco. And you can see the dead bodies of some that have attempted to cross over. And again, I want you to think of the human rights implications of these restrictive policies that are actually growing and intensifying, not only in this region, but all over the world. Of course, there's civil reaction. Civil society comes through and tries to protest this, by offering, some kind of peaceful incentives. Migration by sea. So we talked about Ceuta and Melilla, which is trying to cross over from Morocco by land to these Spanish enclaves in Africa. But the other way to do it is by crossing that Strait of Gibraltar. And to do that, many of them use these fishermen boats, known as the pateras, to cross, or they can use speedboats. All this can be arranged through the smugglers. We talked about that. The other route is crossing to the Canary Islands. You know where the Canary Islands are situated? They're also right off of Africa. Let's go back to the map. I hope I can find them. Whoops. They're not visible here, but they're somewhere right off this coast. But they also are Spanish territories. So just like Ceuta and Melilla are Spanish territories, the Canary Islands are also Spanish territories. So again, the African immigrants attempt to, something happen? So they attempt to cross also by boats, pateras or other speedboats, to the Canary Islands, because again, once they get to the Canary Islands, they can take a flight, to get to Spain without going through border security and so forth. And you can see thousands of immigrants try to get to the Canary Islands. Only in 2006, 6,000 of them died just attempting to reach the islands. Again, there's all kinds of patrol by helicopters, by planes, by cars, by security, just like the United States. Okay. And of course, many of them almost drown, and some of them are rescued by rescue teams, search and rescue teams. Again, just like similar to the US-Mexico border, where there's a lot of search and rescue teams that organize themselves to try to rescue Mexicans and other immigrants from Central America trying to enter through desert and other hazardous areas. Some of them are delighted to actually make the journey alive and think that they can have economic opportunities, better economic opportunities in Europe. But unfortunately, many of them, as soon as they arrive, they're going to be detained, and many of them end up being sent back. And this is in violation of the refugee law that I told you about, and especially for asylum seekers who try to enter, the countries where they enter to are obligated to actually protect and assist them. But that doesn't often happen. Many of them are detained, sent back without even examining their claims and trying to show that some of these claims are actually true, that they're trying to flee areas where they are persecuted. You can see the dead bodies. I was just telling my colleague Brian that in the United States, they don't show corpses. It's just not acceptable to show corpses. But showing corpses really sort of, shows you or highlights, makes visible the suffering and pain that migrants go through, especially those coming from sub-Saharan Africa. Some of them attempt to get on the trucks, and sometimes these trucks are coolants, so they're freezing, and sometimes they die, from being frozen from hypothermia, and others. Coffins of also children who die also crossing the border between Morocco and Spain, and community organizers to try to protest the deaths. Just like in the United States, again, there's a lot of human rights organizations and NGOs at the border in Arizona and Texas and other places that organize to try to raise awareness about the human rights implications at the border. Contrast this. What is the difference? I mean, we're almost done, so I'm right on time, actually. This is great. What is the difference between these two? What kind of stories do they tell? Yes? Homeless affluents. Both are what? Both are immigrants. What is the difference? Both of them are immigrants. Exactly. This is in Spain. This is the story of many who try to cross from sub-Saharan Africa and North African countries to get to Spain and other European countries. Most of them end up homeless. Most of them end up without work. The others are immigrants from Germany, and some come also from Central Europe and other European countries. The skin color makes a difference. You can see the affluence. You can see they go there to Spain with ease. They don't face discrimination. They don't face resentment. They don't face the xenophobia that many people of color face when they try to cross borders and go to, countries that are more affluent, where they're trying to seek better opportunities. And I think I will stop here, and thank you so much for coming to the talk. And if you have any other questions, I'd be very happy to talk to you. Thank you so much again. I want to end, though, and say that this immigration flow will continue so long as there are regions that are unequal economically, so long as there are no opportunities in these countries that they migrate from, and there's a high youth bulge that causes a lot of unemployment, that will continue to have these flows. People will continue to take these risks. Some of them will continue to face death because of this economic inequality that exists between the regions. Thank you so much.